The shocking mistake that got me banned from Dubai. Update. It's not Etisalat. My name cleared. Hook. I thought I was just a tourist, but what I discovered in Dubai turned my life into a nightmare. Watch until the end to uncover the shocking truth that nearly got me banned forever. I stepped off the plane, sweat already gathering on my forehead. Dubai. It was everything I had imagined, yet nothing like I expected. The heat slammed into me, thick and suffocating. I wiped my brow and moved through the terminal, the smell of incense and something sweet in the air. I had made it, but there was a nagging feeling. I couldn't shake it. Everything seemed normal at first. Customs was smooth. A glance at my passport, a few quick questions, but then it happened. I was pulled aside. "Come with us," the officer said. My heart sank. Why? What did I do wrong? I followed him, my mind racing. They took me into a small, sterile room. The walls felt too close. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Too loud. He sat me down across from him. The silence was suffocating. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked, his voice calm, too calm. I shook my head. "I don't understand," I stammered. "Your mistake," he said slowly, almost with a hint of satisfaction, "is bigger than you think." My hands began to shake. What mistake? I tried to think back, retracing every step. The flight? The customs process? My phone, maybe? I scanned my memory, frantic, but nothing seemed off. Then he pulled out a document, a paper that I had never seen before. "Etisalat," he said. "This isn't about them." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "The issue isn't your service provider." I still didn't get it. What was he talking about? Then came the words that stopped my heart. "You've been flagged. You're not welcome here." My throat tightened. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. The room seemed to spin. The officer leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "It's not the company," he said again. "It's, I felt cold. The room felt colder. I was just a traveler. What did I do? The air became thick, suffocating. He handed me back my passport, eyes still locked on mine. "Pack your bags," he said softly. "You're leaving?" I couldn't move. My mind was blank. The door opened, and 2 more officers stepped in. They didn't say a word, just stood there. My feet felt glued to the floor. I couldn't breathe. Everything I thought I knew was crashing down around me. This wasn't just a mistake. This was something else. The officers motioned for me to stand. I didn't move. I felt like my body had betrayed me. My legs were stiff, unresponsive. The room was closing in. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. The air felt so thick now, like it was choking me. One officer took a step forward, his eyes piercing through me. "Let's go," he said, his tone final. I had no choice. I stumbled to my feet, every step a battle. They led me down the narrow corridor, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. We passed through several hallways. The walls were bare, sterile, and unwelcoming. The fluorescent lights buzzed like an insect, buzzing louder the deeper we went. The officers said nothing. I could feel their presence behind me, looming, watching. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. We reached a door. It was heavy metallic. The officer opened it with a soft click. A cold rush of air hit me. Inside, it was worse. A small, gray room. No windows. Just a chair and a table. The walls lined with cameras. I was pushed into the chair. The door clicked shut behind me. I was alone. My heart was racing. The cold air made me shiver. I tried to steady my breath, but it was impossible. Minutes stretched into hours. The silence was maddening. The door opened again, and the officer from before stepped inside. He looked at me with an unreadable expression. Then he sat down across from me, the chair scraping against the floor. "I'll be honest," he said, his voice low. "We don't make mistakes here." I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" His eyes didn't leave mine. "Your name was flagged. he said. Not by Etisalat. By someone higher. Much higher. My chest tightened. Who? I whispered. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he slid a small piece of paper across the table toward me. I hesitated. When I finally looked at it, my heart stopped. It was a list. A list of names. Names I recognized. Names that were linked to things I never thought I'd be involved in. The officer leaned in, his voice low and deliberate. You're in over your head, he said. And this is just the beginning. I stared at the list, my hands trembling. The names were all connected to people I knew, people I trusted. But this was something else. I glanced up at the officer. His eyes were hard, unreadable. Why me? I managed to choke out. The officer didn't answer immediately. He studied me, his gaze piercing. You don't get to ask why, he said, his voice colder now. You're here because you made a choice. A choice? My mind raced, trying to piece together something that made sense. But I couldn't. I hadn't made any choice, at least not one that should have led to this. I tried to speak, to protest, but the words wouldn't come. The officer stood, his shadow looming over me. We'll be watching, he said softly. Every move you make. And then, without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving the door open just a crack. I sat there, frozen. My breath came in shallow gasps and the room spun. I wasn't supposed to be here. I was just a traveler, just someone who wanted to see Dubai. Yet, somehow, I had been dragged into something far darker than I had ever imagined. The list of names burned in my mind. What was this all about? What had I walked into? And more importantly, what did I do to deserve this? I looked around the room, the walls closing in again. The lights flickered above me, casting eerie shadows across the cold, gray walls. The minutes dragged on, each one more suffocating than the last. I couldn't think clearly. I had no answers. But one thing was certain. I wasn't leaving Dubai anytime soon. And whatever this was, this mess I was caught in, was only just beginning. The silence in the room was deafening. I couldn't stop staring at the open door, half expecting someone else to come in. But nobody did. The minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. What was I supposed to do now? The lists, those names, they gnawed at me. Impossible to ignore. I felt like I was in some kind of trap, a game where the rules were written in invisible ink, and I couldn't even see the playing field. The door remained ajar, just enough for me to hear the muffled sounds from the corridor outside. Footsteps, voices, but no one came for me. I wanted to move, to get out, but the chair felt like a weight holding me down. My mind spun through every possible scenario, trying to make sense of it all. I thought back to my arrival in Dubai, the easy customs check, the pleasant greeting. Had I missed something? Had I overlooked some warning sign? My phone buzzed suddenly in my pocket, making me jump. I pulled it out instinctively, desperate for some kind of connection to the outside world. It was a text from an unknown number. Don't trust them. You're being watched. The words sent a shiver down my spine. I stared at the screen, frozen. Who was this? How did they know what was happening? I tried to respond, but the phone flickered and died in my hand. The screen went black, and no amount of pressing the power button would turn it on. It was as if my connection to the outside world had just been severed. I glanced toward the door, wondering if the officer had somehow found out about the message. My heart raced. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, the noise echoing in the small, cold room. I walked over to the door and peered out. The hallway was empty, just the faint sound of voices drifting from somewhere farther down the corridor. I stepped into the hallway cautiously, my footsteps quiet but urgent. The weight of the situation pressed down on me with every step. I couldn't stay in that room. I had to find out what was really going on. I had to find a way out, before it was too late. But every corner seemed to lead to more questions, more danger. The walls felt like they were closing in. I didn't know who to trust anymore. The officer's words echoed in my mind. You're in over your head. I was in deep, and the deeper I went, the more I realized I might never find my way out. I moved quietly down the hall, trying to stay as invisible as possible. Each step felt heavier than the last. My heart hammered in my chest, my mind racing. What was I even looking for? I wasn't sure anymore. I turned a corner and froze. A figure, just ahead, by a door that looked like it led to another hallway. It was a woman, dressed in all black. She was standing still, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. She didn't move, just stared. I could feel her gaze, sharp, penetrating. I had no idea if she was a friend or a foe. But she was the first person I'd seen who seemed to be waiting for me, not guarding me. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. Before I could even make a sound, she took a step toward me. I stepped back instinctively, my nerves shooting through me like an electric shock. But she didn't seem threatening. She wasn't armed, no aggressive stance, just calm. "Don't go further," she said, her voice low, barely a whisper. My mind screamed at me to ask her why, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there, staring at her, caught in some unspoken tension. "Who are you?" I finally managed to ask, my voice shaky. She didn't answer directly. She looked over her shoulder, scanning the hallway. Then she turned her attention back to me. "You're being hunted," she said, her voice barely audible. "Not by the officers. By someone much worse." I froze, unable to process the weight of her words. Hunted? My mind raced. Who could possibly be hunting me? "You have to trust me," she continued, her eyes locking onto mine. "There's no time to explain everything." I opened my mouth, but she put a finger to her lips. "Listen," she said, urgency in her voice. "You're being tracked, but not by the people you think. They've got you marked." A cold chill ran through me. What did that mean? "Are you here to help me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, but quickly glanced around again, her expression tense. "We don't have much time. They'll be looking for you. You have to move." Before I could respond, she stepped back, her eyes scanning the hallway once more. Then she motioned for me to follow. I hesitated, torn between fear and the desperate need to get out of this nightmare. But I didn't have a choice. I followed her, keeping close, every step feeling like it might be my last. She led me through a maze of corridors, always keeping her pace steady and calm. I barely noticed how much time passed. The building felt more like a labyrinth, its cold, clinical walls closing in around me. We stopped at a door, the only thing between me and whatever was waiting outside. She turned to me, her face serious. "Remember this?" she said, her voice a hushed warning. "Don't trust anyone, not even me." I opened my mouth to ask more, but she didn't give me a chance. Without another word, she pushed the door open and stepped through, disappearing into the darkness beyond. I hesitated for a moment, and then, with a deep breath, I followed the door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into near darkness. The air was thick with the scent of dust and something metallic, like old machinery. I could barely make out the shapes around me. The woman was ahead, a shadow against the dim light, filtering in from the cracks of the door we had just entered. I moved forward cautiously, every step feeling like a mistake. The walls here were different, cracked, worn, as if this place hadn't been used in years. We passed through narrow corridors, twisting and turning, my mind struggling to keep up with the maze. I tried to catch my breath, but it felt like I was suffocating, the fear mixing with the suffocating silence. The only sound was the shuffle of our footsteps, growing louder with each step. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. Was I being followed? The woman turned a corner, and I barely kept up with her. She stopped abruptly, her body tensing. "Stay close," she whispered sharply. "They're near." I froze. "Who?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pushed me toward a small door at the end of the corridor. I hesitated, the weight of the situation crashing down on me. Could I trust her? "Don't ask questions," she hissed. "Just go." I didn't think. I just moved. We slipped through the door and into another dark room. The only light now came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, flickering erratically. The room was small, with a metal table at its center, covered in papers and old files. It felt wrong, like a place where things were hidden, buried. She walked to the table, sweeping the papers aside, as though she knew exactly where to look. "Sit," she ordered without looking up. I glanced at the door again, unsure if this was some kind of trap. But she didn't give me a choice. I sat. She continued to shuffle through the papers, muttering under her breath. Minutes passed, each one dragging like an eternity. Finally, she stopped, holding up a small folder, sealed tightly with red tape. "This is why they want you," she said, her voice low, filled with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. I stared at the folder, my heart racing. What was inside? She didn't offer an explanation. She just handed it to me. I reached for it, my hands trembling. As soon as I touched the folder, the lights overhead flickered one last time, then went out, plunging us into complete darkness. The silence that followed felt unbearable. I held the folder in my hands, but now I had no idea what to do next. The woman's voice broke the stillness. "Open it." I swallowed hard, feeling a weight in my chest. The room was closing in on me. My fingers fumbled with the red tape, but I couldn't seem to tear it. What was inside? The woman's breath came faster, her impatience growing. "You don't have much time," she urged, her voice a whisper in the darkness. With one final tug, the tape gave way, and I pulled the folder open. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, and on it, just 2 words that made my stomach drop. "Welcome home." I stared at the paper, my hands shaking as I read those 2 words. Welcome home. A cold, suffocating fear wrapped around me, squeezing the breath from my chest. This didn't make sense. How could this be? The woman's presence felt suddenly oppressive, her form shifting in the near darkness, casting a shadow over me. "Is this some kind of joke?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. She didn't respond right away, just watched me, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You're not from here, are you?" she asked, her voice soft but heavy with meaning. I didn't answer immediately. How could I? Everything felt like it was slipping through my fingers. "Not from here," I repeated, trying to process her words. What was she getting at? I had no ties to Dubai. I was just here on vacation, until everything spiraled out of control. And now this? I looked at the paper again, desperately searching for some kind of explanation. But the words remained the same. I felt like I was suffocating under their weight. "Who sent this?" I asked, the question barely leaving my lips. "Who's behind this?" She moved closer, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in her eyes. Something dark. Something far older than this place. "You don't understand yet," she said softly, almost pityingly. "You're part of something bigger now." The room seemed to close in around me, the air growing thick and heavy, like I was drowning in it. "Bigger? What are you talking about?" But before she could answer, the door behind us creaked open. My heart skipped. 2 men stood in the doorway, faces obscured by shadows. I instinctively pulled back, the folder clenched in my hand. The woman didn't flinch, just stepped aside to let them in. "Is he ready?" one of the men asked, his voice low, a sharp edge to it. The woman nodded, her gaze flickering toward me. "Your past life is over," she said flatly. "You've been marked. You're part of this now, whether you want to be or not. My breath hitched as they took a step closer. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. Your choice, the man said, a cruel smile curling at his lips. You can walk out of here, but you'll never be free again. I didn't know what to do. The world around me felt unreal. Welcome home, the woman whispered again, her voice fading as the men stepped forward. Closing in on me, the world seemed to slow, like the air itself had thickened, making every movement, every breath harder to take. I stood there, frozen. The man's words echoed in my mind. You'll never be free again. My heart raced as I glanced at the men closing in. There was no way out. The woman had been right. Whatever this was, I was already tangled in it. But could I fight back? A sudden surge of defiance rose inside me. Maybe I didn't have control over this twisted situation. Maybe I didn't even understand it. But I wasn't just going to roll over. I straightened, clutching the folder tighter in my hands. My fingers trembled, but I forced them still. The men stepped closer, and one of them reached out, his hand coming toward me like a snake ready to strike. Without thinking, I stepped back, my mind screaming for a way out. Stop, I shouted, more out of instinct than any real hope it would make a difference. The room fell silent. The man stopped. The other stood still, his gaze unwavering. I glanced at the woman, whose expression had not changed. She watched me impassive, as if this was all some twisted performance I was only now beginning to understand. A cold realization hit me. I was being tested. Leave him, the woman finally said, her voice sharp. He's not one of them yet. The men hesitated for a moment, their eyes flickering between me and her. One of them nodded, and without another word, they turned and walked back toward the door, disappearing into the shadows. I stood there, my breath shallow and unsteady. I was left with only silence again, but it was different now, heavier. The woman stepped closer, the flickering light casting long shadows across her face. This isn't over, she said, her voice low. It's only just begun. I wanted to ask more, but no words came. She was right. I had stepped into something far bigger than I could have ever imagined, but there was no going back. With the folder still in my hand, I turned toward the door she had led me through. I wasn't sure what waited beyond it, or what I would have to face. But somehow, I knew I had no choice but to keep moving forward. And whatever this home meant, it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.